She gave her last $10 to a stranger at a rainy train station and never expected to see him again. But when he returned, everything in her life changed. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The station, nestled in the heart of Harrison, Pennsylvania, was nearly empty, cloaked in the gray haze of a cold March rain. Puddles gathered in the worn cracks of the platform, and the sky seemed to hang lower with each passing minute. Jane pulled her coat tighter around her petite frame, her fingers flushed red from the cold. She was 24, just old enough to feel worn out, yet still young enough to chase a dream. The job interview she was heading to felt like a fading thread of hope, but it was the only one left. Her eyes flicked from the cracked schedule board to the wrinkled ticket in her hand. She had just enough time. Then came the voice. "Excuse me." Soft. Hesitant. She turned, startled. A man stood only a few feet away, rain soaking through the shoulders of his thin jacket. His beard was unkempt, his damp hair clung to his forehead, and his eyes, blue, weary, and almost apologetic, met hers. "I'm sorry," he said again, shivering. I had my wallet stolen. I just need $10 for a ticket home. I promise I'll pay you back, if you could just trust me. Please." Jane blinked. For a long second, neither of them moved. The only sound was the distant hum of a train approaching and the rain tapping steadily on the metal roof. $10. That was all she had left. In her pocket sat a single, crumpled bill, the remainder after she'd paid for her ticket and a cheap cup of instant coffee. $10 she'd planned to use for a small meal after the interview. $10 stood between her and complete emptiness. She could walk away. She probably should. But she didn't. Instead, she looked more closely at him. His lips were trembling, his hands reddened from the cold. But it wasn't just the way he looked. It was his eyes, tired, heavy, filled with a kind of quiet shame. No threat. No manipulation. Just worn out. "Do you have anyone you can call?" she asked. He shook his head. "Phone's dead. I tried asking others. No one wanted to stop. And how do I know you're not lying?" Her voice was cautious. "You don't," he said honestly. "But I swear. I just want to get home." She should have walked away. But something in her, something that still remembered who she'd been before her mom died, before the job loss, the loneliness, whispered, "Help him." Without speaking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the bill. Her hand hovered midair, heart racing. This is nuts, she thought. Totally irrational. She looked at him again, then slowly extended her hand. "I don't know why," she said quietly, "but I believe you." He stared at her hand like he wasn't sure it was real. Then, almost reverently, he took the bill. "I promise I'll pay you back," he said, his voice cracking. Jane gave a faint smile. "Just get home safe." He opened his mouth to say more, but then the train pulled in, hissing as it stopped. The man nodded, turned, and disappeared into the crowd boarding the train. Within moments, he was gone. Jane stood still, the damp wind brushing past her face, her stomach twisting with uncertainty. That was it. Her last $10 gone. She didn't even know his name. The loudspeaker announced the next departure. She checked the time again. Her train was next, her chance, maybe her last. She climbed aboard, water dripping from her sleeves, and sank into a window seat. The rain blurred the glass as the platform disappeared behind her. She didn't know it yet, but that quiet act of generosity, offering her last $10, was the moment her life began to shift. The next morning, Jane stood outside the building where her interview was scheduled. Her hair was still damp from the drizzle. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten. Not because she forgot, but because her wallet now held only expired receipts and an old photo of her mother. She was 20 minutes late. The city bus required exact change, and she had none. She tried walking, cutting through unfamiliar alleys and blocks, but Harrison was vast and indifferent. By the time she arrived, the receptionist gave her a tight, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, the interviewer had to leave for another meeting. You'll need to reschedule." Jane tried to explain. She even offered to wait. But the woman had already turned back to her computer. Jane left the building with slumped shoulders, her wet socks squishing inside her shoes. The wind cut through her like paper. For a long while, she just stood there on the sidewalk, watching people pass. Busy, dry, warm. A world that moved forward with or without her. By the time she made it back to her tiny rented room, a narrow bed, a shared bathroom, and a flickering hallway light, her landlord was waiting by the door. "Rent was due 3 days ago, Jane." "I know. I'm trying." "You said that last week." "I can't keep extending it. Just give me until Friday. I've got someone else ready to move in tomorrow." "I'm sorry." She didn't argue. What would be the point? She packed the few things she had into a fraying backpack. 2 changes of clothes. A cracked phone with no service. A dog-eared paperback her mother used to read to her. She didn't cry. Not yet. That night, she found a corner in the Eastfield Public Library which stayed open 24 hours. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled like old pages and stale coffee. The security guard gave her a wary glance when she curled up in a chair behind the nonfiction shelves. The next night, he asked her to leave. The benches in the park weren't soft. They were cold, metallic, and unkind. But the stars above were quiet, and the city, in its strange way, seemed to pause after midnight. She hugged her backpack to her chest and tried to disappear. Every day blurred into the next. She looked for work but had no address to list, no phone number to answer. She drifted between libraries, shelters, and job centers. Hope began to feel like a cruel joke. And yet, sometimes, during those long, aching afternoons, she would remember his face. That man from Crescent Hill Station. His voice. His tired eyes. That moment when he had looked at her like she was the first person to really see him. And in those moments, she wondered, had she been foolish? Was it naive to give away her last $10? She had nothing now. No money. No home. No plan. No family. And still, there was a strange, quiet peace that lived in that memory. She had helped someone. Maybe even saved someone. She'd done the right thing, not because she had to, but because something inside her believed it mattered. But that peace was small and the cold was immense. One rainy evening, as she sat at the edge of a park bench trying to dry her socks in the last rays of sunlight, a group of teenagers walked past. One of them tossed an empty soda can her way and laughed. Get a job, he muttered under his breath. She didn't look up. That night, she returned to the library, but the doors were locked. It was a holiday. She wandered the streets of Harrison until nearly midnight, then curled up inside a bus shelter. It protected her from the wind, but not from fear. That was the night she cried. Not with sobs. Just quiet, steady tears that soaked into her coat collar. She missed her mother's voice, her laugh, her warmth. She missed feeling safe. Feeling seen. Her stomach was empty, but the hollowness in her chest hurt more. When the sun rose the next morning, it found her still there. Eyes swollen. Hair matted. Heart bruised. She had hit bottom. There was nowhere lower to fall, and yet she was still breathing. It was a Tuesday morning when she met Ruth. The park was quiet, with only the occasional jogger cutting through the lingering fog. Jane sat on her usual bench near the statue of some long-forgotten general, her knees tucked to her chest, coat zipped up tight, though it did little to stop the chill in her bones. She hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. The hunger was dull now, but constant, like the buzz of a bad memory that wouldn't go away. Then she saw the woman. She looked to be in her 70s, but her movements were graceful and steady. She wore a soft wool shawl and carried a small brown paper bag in her gloved hands. As she neared the bench, she stopped and looked directly at Jane. You look hungry, she said gently. Jane blinked, unsure if she was being pitied or judged. I'm fine, she said automatically. The woman smiled kindly, patiently, and sat beside her. She placed the paper bag on the bench between them and slowly opened it. I always bring extra, she said. Just in case I meet someone who needs it. Inside was a thick sandwich, fresh, imperfect slices of bread with ham, cheese, and a smear of mustard. Jane stared at it. I can't take that, she whispered. Why not? The woman asked. Is your pride louder than your hunger? Jane looked away, ashamed. The woman waited silent, gentle, without pressure. At last, Jane took the sandwich. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. The first bite made her eyes sting. Thank you, she said, the words barely getting past the lump in her throat. The woman nodded, warm and knowing. There's a place on Monroe Street, the Gathering Table. It's a soup kitchen, the woman said. They serve lunch. They're often short on help. You think they'd let me volunteer? Jane asked quietly. Ask for Carol, the woman said, rising to her feet. Tell her Ruth sent you. And then she walked away, slowly but purposefully, her shawl catching the morning breeze. Jane sat staring after her for a long moment, then looked down at the sandwich in her lap, half-eaten but more nourishing than anything she'd tasted in days. That afternoon, Jane found the Gathering Table. The building was modest, its brick walls faded and the wooden sign a little chipped but welcoming. Inside, the smell of simmering stew and fresh bread wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. She asked for Carol. Carol turned out to be a brisk, focused woman in her 50s with sleeves rolled up and a clipboard always in one hand. When Jane mentioned Ruth had sent her, Carol's face softened noticeably. Ruth has a gift for finding people who need a second chance, she said. You willing to work? Jane nodded quickly. Then grab an apron. The hours that followed were a blur, slicing vegetables, wiping down tables, pouring soup into mismatched bowls. Jane's hands moved automatically, but her mind buzzed. People came in from all walks of life, tired, worn, quiet, but they smiled. They said thank you. One man told corny jokes while waiting for his food. Another offered to sweep the floor when he was done. A little girl with tangled curls handed Jane a crayon drawing of a sunflower. By the end of the day, Jane's feet ached, but for the first time in weeks, she felt human again. She came back the next day. And the one after that. Not for food, though it was always offered, but because the place felt like purpose. She peeled potatoes. She folded napkins. She learned the names of the regulars. She listened to stories, hard stories, but also stories filled with humor, grit, and hope. People who had lost everything and still showed up with light in their eyes. One evening, after the last bowl had been dried and stacked, Carol handed Jane a small envelope. Just a little stipend, she said. You've more than earned it. Jane opened it later. Inside was $20. Enough for a bus pass. A couple of days of stability. But more than that, it was the trust. The acknowledgement. Proof that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible anymore. She sat outside on the curb watching the sun melt into golden rooftops. For the first time in what felt like ages, she didn't feel like she was falling. She was still poor. Still uncertain. Still alone in many ways. But she had something to hold onto now. A sliver of light. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon at the gathering table. The lunch rush had just ended and the air was still rich with the scent of lentil stew and warm cornbread. Jane was wiping down tables, humming to herself, when the bell over the door jingled. She looked up. A man stepped inside. His coat was tailored, his shoes polished, his hair carefully combed. Not the usual guest. Not by a long shot. But it wasn't the expensive clothes that caught her attention. It was his face. Her breath caught. There was something about his eyes, steady, ocean blue, quietly familiar. He glanced around, not lost, but searching. And when his gaze landed on her, he stopped in his tracks. Then, slowly, the faintest smile touched his lips. Jane set her rag down. Her heart pounded. It couldn't be. But it was. He walked toward her, calm and confident. Hi, he said, his voice deeper than she remembered. Warmer. Jane blinked. Do I know you? He tilted his head, the smile lingering. You do. Or at least, you once trusted me when no one else would. And just like that, everything fell into place. The train station. The rain. The crumpled $10 bill. You, she whispered. He nodded. I was a mess that day. Cold. Broke. Desperate. You gave me everything you had. Jane looked at him again, really looked. The scruffy stranger from the station was gone. Standing before her was someone composed, sharp. Someone who looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not a soup kitchen. I never got your name, she said quietly. Miles, he replied. Miles Clinkate. She repeated it under her breath, anchoring herself. He smiled. I came back the next day, you know. To the station. But you were gone. I checked the platform, the kiosk, even the lost and found. No one knew who you were. I didn't even have your name. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, Jane admitted. Miles gave a softer smile. Neither did I. But I never forgot your face. Jane folded her arms across her apron, stunned. Why are you here? I was passing through the neighborhood. Saw the sign. Something told me to stop. She raised an eyebrow. No one just stops here. Not in that jacket. He looked around, taking in the space. You work here. I volunteer, she said. Helps keep my head above water. He nodded, serious. You helped me when I had nothing. I'd like to return the favor. She shook her head slowly. That's not why I gave you the money. I know, he said. That's exactly why I want to. He reached into his coat, pulled out his wallet, and hesitated. I brought this, he said, handing her a crisp $10 bill. To pay you back. Jane stared at it. Then laughed, softly, not mockingly. Just amazed. She took it, her fingers brushing his. Thank you. He wasn't done. And more than that, he added, I'd love to take you to dinner sometime. Or at least coffee. Jane glanced at the bill in her hand, then looked back at him. Everything about the moment felt unreal. Like she'd walked into someone else's life. You're really not who I thought you were, she said. No, Miles replied. I'm not. And suddenly she realized, neither was she. Later, they sat across from each other in a cozy corner of a nearby cafe called August Roast. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and warm lighting and slow jazz on the speakers. Jane still wore her apron under her coat, hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea with honey ordered for her by Miles. She hadn't had anything that comforting in weeks. Miles stirred his espresso, then glanced at her. You're probably wondering who I really am. Jane gave a small smile. Well, yeah. He reached into his coat and slid a sleek black business card across the table. Jane hesitated, then picked it up. Miles Clinkate, CEO, Edenova Systems. Founder, Clinkate Foundation. She blinked. Edenova? That's your company. Miles nodded. I started it about 10 years ago. We design adaptive learning software and AI tools for schools and nonprofits. It took off faster than I ever imagined. Jane's mouth opened, then closed again. She had heard of Edenova. Everyone had. It had been on the news for revolutionizing access to education in underserved communities. She remembered reading about it once. Back when she still had a job, a couch, and something warm to drink while she read. But that day at the station, she asked. Miles smiled a little. I was doing something reckless. I was working on a new outreach project through the Clinkate Foundation. One initiative is focused on understanding homelessness from the inside, so we can build better support systems. I didn't want to just read about it. I wanted to see it, feel it. So I went undercover. No phone, no ID, just the clothes on my back. He leaned forward slightly. I had everything planned, except getting my pocket picked on day one. Jane let out a breath of disbelief, half laughing. So you were actually stranded? I was, he said. Everyone I asked for help either ignored me or looked the other way. He looked at her with softness in his eyes. Everyone except you. Jane felt her cheeks flush. He continued, you didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything in return. You gave me your last dollar and then disappeared. That stuck with me. Jane looked down at her tea. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I honestly thought I was just being naive. You weren't, he said, his voice steady. You were kind. You were real. I've met people with status and power. But in that moment, you had more integrity than most of them ever will. He paused. That's why I've been looking for you. Because I want to offer you something, if you're open to it. Jane raised her eyes. What kind of something? Miles leaned back in his chair, calm and sincere. I want you to work with us, not at Edenova, but at the Clinkate Foundation. We run programs that support people like you once were. Resilient, overlooked, full of potential. We fund grassroots initiatives, youth projects, community kitchens, micro-enterprises. But we need people with heart, people who get it, people like you. She blinked, stunned. I don't have a degree. I don't even have a stable place to live. Miles smiled. We've hired people with Ivy League diplomas and people who've lived in tents. What matters is your story, your compassion, the fact that you helped someone when you had nothing. Jane sat back, the weight of the past few weeks settling over her shoulders. The cold benches, the hunger, the silence. And now this? You really mean it, she whispered. Miles nodded. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. What would I do? She asked. You'd start by learning training. We get you somewhere safe to stay. Then you join one of our local teams, help shape programs. Eventually, maybe even lead one. For a long moment, Jane didn't speak. The room faded around her, and all that remained was the warmth of the tea in her hands and the rising pulse of hope in her chest. I don't know what to say, she murmured. Miles gave her a small, hopeful smile. Say yes. Let's start changing lives, beginning with yours. Jane looked at him, the stranger she once helped without knowing his name. Now sitting before her like a door she never thought would open. And somewhere deep inside, something shifted. A belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to stay lost. She took a shaky breath. Okay, she said. And in that moment, everything changed. Jane's first day at the Clinkate Foundation HQ felt like stepping into another world. A place she had only ever seen through bus windows and job listings. The office was set inside a restored brick building, full of light, quiet music, and energy. Young people hustled between whiteboards and laptops. The walls were covered with portraits and quotes from lives transformed. And when Miles introduced her to the team, he didn't say, this is someone we're helping. He said, this is someone we believe in. That alone changed everything. He didn't treat her like a charity case. He treated her like a partner. Like someone with value. Over the next few weeks, Jane threw herself into training. She learned about community planning, social impact design, grant writing. She shadowed field coordinators, visited food banks, youth shelters, recovery centers. And slowly, piece by piece, the parts of her that had crumbled began to rebuild. Then came the moment Miles handed her a slim folder. Your pilot project, he said. Design something meaningful to you. We'll back it. Inside was a typed-up version of the concept she had scribbled one night while helping at the gathering table. A mobile soup kitchen, a van that could move between underserved areas, bringing warm meals and human connection straight to the people who needed it most. People like she once had been. The idea had come to her while drying trays at the end of a long shift. She'd remembered the shame of entering fixed-location shelters, the fear of being seen, the feeling of walking away because it was just too hard. But what if support could come to them? Miles believed in it. So did the board. The Clinkate Foundation funded the prototype. They gave her a small team, and they gave her trust. The first time she saw the finished van, painted soft sky blue with Open Hands Project written gently across the side, Jane stood in the lot and cried. Her first night driving the van, she returned to a park she knew too well, a place where she had once curled up beneath a chipped statue and wished for another life. That evening, she served over 100 meals. But more than food, she gave out kindness. Names remembered, hugs, listening ears. And as word spread, so did the reach of her project. In the quiet moments between chopping vegetables and sketching new routes, Jane found herself seeing Miles differently. Not just as the man from the train station, not just as the CEO who changed her life, but as someone consistent, steady, someone who always showed up, with encouragement, bad jokes, and warm coffee when she needed it most. Their connection deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. A late walk after a community event. A shared laugh over a burnt tray of cookies at the test kitchen. He listened like no one else ever had. And without realizing it, Jane began to trust him. One Saturday, after a long community lunch event, she noticed a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench beneath the trees. Her heart jumped. It was Ruth, the woman with the sandwich. Jane rushed over. "I've thought about you every day since," she said breathlessly. "You saved me." Ruth smiled gently. "All I did was feed a hungry girl." They sat together, talking like long-lost friends, catching up on time that had somehow always been connected. Then Ruth gave her hand a soft pat and chuckled. "I had a feeling you'd find your way to Miles." Jane blinked. "Wait, you know him?" "I should," Ruth said with a glint in her eye. "He's my son." The world tilted slightly. "You sent me to Carol. You knew exactly what you were doing." Ruth nodded. "Miles told me about the girl who gave him her last $10 when he had nothing. I had to meet her. And when I did, I saw what he saw. A heart too good to go unnoticed." Jane sat back, stunned. "All this time." "It's funny, isn't it?" Ruth said. "How one small act of kindness can ripple into something neither of you could have imagined." That night, Jane and Miles sat on the rooftop garden of the Foundation's office, the city of Harrison glowing below like distant stars. She told him everything about the sandwich, about Ruth, about the way their paths had been crossing long before either of them knew it. Miles listened closely, then reached for her hand. "I used to think fate was just coincidence we gave meaning to," he said. "But meeting you changed that." Jane looked at him, really looked. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in something bigger. That maybe every tear, every bench, every sleepless night had led here. To purpose. To love. To a future. In that moment, everything made sense. The train station. The sandwich in the park. The soup kitchen. The van with open hands painted on the side. It had all been leading to this. To who she had become. Spring had arrived in Harrison and the city buzzed with new energy. Jane and Miles were walking through a vibrant community garden downtown, where the Open Hands Project had recently partnered with a local shelter to provide meals and job training. Children chased each other between rows of sprouting herbs. Volunteers laughed, hauling buckets of soil. Miles had been quiet all afternoon, something thoughtful behind his calm smile. As they reached the back of the garden under the shade of a blossoming magnolia tree, he finally spoke. "I've been offered a new opportunity," he said gently. "We're opening a satellite office in New York. The foundation's expanding and they want someone to lead the urban outreach team there." Jane stopped walking. "You?" He nodded. "They asked me to take it. But I told them I wouldn't go without offering you the same chance." Her breath caught. "You want me to come with you?" "I do," Miles said. "To help lead the next chapter of Open Hands. We could reach more people, build on everything we've started." Jane didn't answer right away. She looked around the garden, the soft light, the volunteers, the old man laughing with a young girl over flower seeds. Her eyes landed on a woman she'd helped in her second week of volunteering. Someone who'd once been as lost as she had been. This place, this city. It had held her when she had nothing. It had let her fall and then taught her how to rise. I don't know, Jane said quietly. I love what we're building here. These people, they believed in me before I believed in myself. Miles nodded. There was no disappointment in his face, only understanding. I figured you might feel that way. I'm not saying no, she added quickly. I feel like I'm still supposed to be here a little longer. There's work to do. I know, he said with a soft smile. That's one of the things I admire most about you. They sat together on a nearby bench, letting the sounds of the garden settle around them. I guess this is where the road splits, Jane said. Maybe, Miles replied. But only in distance. Not in heart. Jane turned to him, eyes searching. You think we can make this work? I think we already are, Miles said. You and me, we're not tied to a single city. We're tied to what we believe in, what we've lived through. And we'll keep building, maybe in different places, but still together. Jane smiled, a little sad, but steady. You're going to do incredible things there. So will you, he said. They made a plan. Miles would move to New York in the fall. Jane would continue running Open Hands in Harrison. They'd stay in touch through weekly calls, joint projects, random midnight texts filled with updates and dreams. Their story wasn't ending. It was just changing shape. And as they stood beneath that blooming magnolia tree, the wind spinning petals into the air around them, Jane knew one thing for certain. She wasn't losing him. They were simply planting roots in different soil. 1 year later, Harrison had changed. Or maybe Jane had. The streets no longer looked like mazes of hardship. They looked like opportunities, connections, home. The Open Hands project had grown beyond what she'd imagined. Expanding routes, a fleet of mobile units, a rotating team of staff and volunteers. Over 2,000 meals served weekly. But it wasn't just food. It was eye contact, conversations, dignity, possibility. National media had taken notice. Just last month, Jane flew to Washington, D.C. to accept an award for community innovation on behalf of her team. As she stood at the podium, flashes clicking, lights blinding, she thought of the park bench she once slept on, the sandwich from Ruth, the man at the train station, the $10 she thought was gone forever. Now she was the director of a full-scale resource center with showers, job training, mental health support, and art rooms. Her hands, once shaking, now held the keys to a place where others could begin again. Still, every morning she started just like always, tying on her apron, greeting guests by name. On the anniversary of Open Hands, the team held a celebration. Balloons. A string of photos clipped to twine, each one showing meals shared, lives touched, smiles earned. Jane arrived late, just back from a grant meeting downtown. She stepped into the hall, scanning the room, heart full. And there he was. Miles? He stood by the serving table, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. And something else tucked discreetly in his coat pocket. Their eyes locked. And in that moment, the noise of the room seemed to fall away. He crossed the space slowly, smiling older, wiser, somehow even more at peace. Hi, he said softly. Jane laughed through a swell of sudden tears. You came back. I told you I would. The room seemed to pause as if sensing something more than a reunion. Miles reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. But before he opened it, he took out something else. A crisp, unfolded $10 bill. I've been carrying this with me for a year, he said. Not because I owed you anything, but because I needed to remember the moment that changed everything. He opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring. You gave me something I couldn't have bought with $1 million, he said. Faith when I had nothing to show for myself. Let me spend the rest of my life proving you were right. The room held its breath. Jane stared at him completely still. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't stop them. She thought of the girl she'd once been, cold, hungry, scared, holding a wrinkled bill on a rainy platform. And she thought of the man she had trusted before she ever knew who he was. Yes, she whispered. Yes. Applause burst around them, but Jane barely heard it. All she could feel was the warmth of his hand in hers, the steady beat of her heart, and the quiet truth that had carried her here. Later that night, beneath soft string lights and the laughter of people they had once served, Jane held the $10 bill in her hands one final time. She smiled and said aloud, "A little kindness can be the beginning of a miracle." Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of kindness, second chances, and the quiet power of believing in someone even when the world doesn't.